didn't realize that the power of conversation was going to have such a profound effect on so many people, that by just sharing, just opening up and showing the experiences that I went through, especially to our young people, is going to open so many doors for them, as far as recognizing they're not alone, or there are safe people out there to have these conversations with. As you said, they can be very complicated. They can be very, really vulnerable. And if you don't feel as though you have a safe person, it doesn't matter how many times we tell them that we're a safe person, we have to show them. And I think that by talking as we are today, it's a start. So for me, when I was 5 years old, is basically like kind of the first memories of growing up. My parents divorced. I stayed with my father, who was an alcoholic, very functional, high functioning alcoholic. The challenge for him was simply, if there were challenges or issues or complications going on in his life where he should have been addressing them, talking or communicating about them, he didn't. He turned to the alcohol, and he hoped that the problems in his life would just go away on their own. So I'll explain in a couple moments how that played a pretty negative role for me growing up. I was slowly growing into be this horrifically introverted young person. I was so shy that I couldn't speak to anyone, even if it was to have a pleasant conversation, to say hi or laugh like kids do. I was just so shy. I just wanted to be alone. But the other part I remember about being 5, and I know that it kind of comes in a little bit as I go along with my story too, is that I always had the dream that I wanted to grow up to be somebody that could help the 5-year-old little Tad. And what I mean by that is that after the divorce, my dad met this new woman that he felt was, I guess, the woman of his dreams, married her and invited her into my house. But I mean, I'm still 5, maybe 6 years old, sitting at the front door, hoping and waiting that my mom's going to walk through, and that fantasy family, is going to live forever, And unfortunately, when this new woman moved into my life, not only did I know right away that my mom wasn't coming home again, but I also recognized right away that this new woman absolutely hated me. And I know she hated me because when she moved into my life, she had some extreme rules. The first one being by far the biggest rule of all. And that rule was going to be that from that day forward, she was going to lock me in the basement of my house. Now, you touched on a little bit in my bio about, it's a dungy, dark, cold basement, and that'd probably be the best way to describe it. It was it was full for me because I was short. I think the basement is actually a 5-foot space. The windows were up high, so I wouldn't have access to them, but there were 4 windows in total. The back one was permanently cemented over with the outside stairs. And then the 3 other windows down there, if in the spring the bushes outside didn't grow to block the view, then those windows would be boarded up on the inside. So I would never have any idea what was going on outdoors. I was not allowed any toys or anything really to occupy your mind as we do with young people. The only thing I was allowed, and I don't understand why, but I was allowed a small little black and white television that had a couple of antenna on top. And typically the way I knew if it was decent outside weather-wise is because when I fiddled with the antenna on a good day, I would get maybe 1.5 channels. So that was kind of just the way I knew what the weather was. But there was 1 light bulb, no heat, no air conditioning down there. It was just a very terrible, dark place. I guess if there is a saving grace for me is the fact that because it started at such a young age, I didn't necessarily know it was wrong. I didn't know that this is, that what I'm experiencing, other people are not. And of course, being so shy, when I was at school, I wasn't having conversations with others to talk about the weekend or the evening. So I stayed by myself. I wanted to be invisible. It was just one of those things. I didn't want to have conversations. So I guess the saving grace with me being locked in that dungeon was the fact that I didn't know it was wrong. The abuse continued, and it got a lot worse as time went on. That woman recognized that I cried all the time, and she wasn't a caring adult to, pat me on the head and ask what's wrong. It was the one to swat me in the head and tell me I'm wrong. So it was just that even more so wanted to crawl up in myself and just be invisible. I mean, all I could ever do in that basement, shy of if the channels would come in, was to stay curled up in a fetal position against the wall and just wait. And for me, waiting, some of the things that would happen in a day for me that I would, I guess, look forward to in a way, was it was very cyclical on her cycle. I always knew when she was going to scream. I always knew when the abuse was going to happen, because being in the basement, I knew every sound upstairs. So I knew the floorboards creaking. I knew whether it was the soft walk of her or the heavier walk of my father. There was a lock on the door at the top of the stairs, and so I knew the sound of the fiddling of the lock. So I always knew, you know, I had that multiple second, maybe a minute or two warning that she was on the way. So I could just somehow psychologically prepare myself for whatever was coming next. And when she would scream, not always did she come downstairs. It wasn't uncommon for her to stand at the top of the stairs and just scream very wicked, cruel things. Me being out of sight, down in the dark, you know, basement, crying all the time, as I always did. But then sometimes I'd hear the footsteps upstairs, the heavier ones, knowing my dad was on the way. The ice in his glass would jingle and the steps to the basement would creak. He'd round the corner looking for me. And as I mentioned, I was always in the same spot, just curled up against the wall. But he'd come with rum on, like the rum on his breath. He'd find wherever I was, put his arm around me. And then he would always say, "Tad, just ignore her. Just ignore her. She'll stop. She'll stop." And that is how my dad went about resolving those issues I went through. He always went to the little boy and told me to ignore her, instead of doing what he always needed to do, which is go and communicate, go and deal with it, go and put a stop to it, go leave her. I mean, it's easy to say, I know, but these are the things as an adult, and I've got more tools on the tool belt, so to speak, to understand. I didn't know these were options at the time, but I knew that there was something he should have been doing to take care of me, and he wasn't. She got to the point that probably by the time I was about 7 or 8 years old, she decided that I was not even going to be allowed to go upstairs to have dinner with them anymore. So what she'd do some nights is, again, I'd be very, very conscious and aware of the sounds in the house. And I would hear the nights that she was making the dinner, and I could smell food, and like I always knew. I mean, it's so weird how I just knew everything in that house. But what she would do when it was those nights that she would make dinner is I would hear again the lock on the door, and then I'd hear a thump on the floor up above. And that was her taking the plate of food and just dumping it on the floor. And for me, that's when a 5-minute timer just magically started. Basically, when the sound of the thump happened, a 5-minute timer started. So I had 5 minutes to eat as much food off that floor as I could, assuming, of course, that I had heard the thump in the first place. But either way, when the 5 minutes was up, whatever was left, sometimes I was finished, sometimes I hadn't even started. Whatever it was going back, and I'm sure you have a pretty good understanding as a little boy of that I was at the time. She was not a person I was ever going to be able to stand up to. It just wasn't going to be humanly possible for me. But my reprieve, as some would think when they hear my story, is that at least I was allowed to leave the dungeon to go to school every day. But unfortunately, being so horrifically introverted, being abused and neglected at home, and I did at the time, was that I was a big target at school. And it started very early, and it started very often. Started so small, just a bad name. And for me, that was a trigger. All I needed was to be called a bad name, and it wouldn't have mattered where I was in a school, how many people or how few people. If I heard the name, I was going to cry. And as you can well imagine, it just takes a snicker from somebody, a giggle, a laugh. I mean, we're talking very young kids here. But it didn't take very long before it was allowed to continue. Silence allowed it to continue. I didn't speak up. No adults were seeing it. Now, granted, we didn't have bullying awareness then as we do now, but the other kids weren't doing anything. So when you giggle, that is a sign of acceptance of what's going on, because it empowers the bully to believe that what they're doing is appropriate. It's okay. I made someone laugh. Like, look, that's a good thing. And it makes me, being the bully, feel better. So the bullying, it did get worse, and it progressed all the way through school. So I grew up in, I guess, a semi-decent size where we had elementary, junior high, and senior high. Bullying started grade 3. By grade 6, when I went to junior high, that's when it was the hair pulled out, spit on, pushed down the school stairs. By the time I went to high school, of course, it's a change of school. So in my mind, subconsciously, I'm like, wow, maybe this will be the fix. Maybe everyone's like, grown up. It's an adult learning environment, high schools are. And No, nothing changed. It just simply got worse. And those were the days that I'd be chased home from school, sucker punch, beat up so bad I wouldn't even know my name. But it won't surprise you, nor does it surprise very many people when I say that how I went about resolving my own issues is I did absolutely nothing. And I'm sure that's because my one and only role model, and I say that very loosely, of course, my father, didn't address anything either. So that's what I was growing up understanding, is that you just hold it in. You don't say anything, and what's anyone going to do anyways? I mean, worst case scenario or best case, if an adult were to learn what was going on, well, they're going to call my parents, and that's not going to work well for me. So I held it in, and every facet of life, I just held in, just wanting to escape reality. I just wanted to be invisible. But as I grew to about 11 or 12 years old, my dad on Sundays realized that that woman absolutely hated his parents, and they were both in a nursing home. And so that was kind of our escape. So he would on Sunday mornings ask, Tad, do you want to come with me, go visit your grandparents, or do you want to stay here at the house? Obviously, I'm going to say I want to go visit my grandparents, and it's time with my dad, who I really did cherish at a young age. We'd go visit my grandparents, but it'd be a very short visit. And what we would do is we'd go visit a family friend. But unbeknownst to my father, and he would never have known, is that in that home, there was a much older man that was sexually abusing me. So because it wasn't uncommon, so this individual would have been, this individual would have been probably 10 years older than I was. So for the adults, it's like, hey guys, go play. Totally makes sense. I understand that. But while we were away playing is when things were taking place. And again, that's where I really started to learn the separation from mind to body. It's I just wasn't present. I was in my mind doing whatever I could to keep myself busy and occupied. The challenge was, however, is that as you're well aware, the mental health aspect of everything I was going through was just manifesting from the challenges at school, the abuse at home, now the sexual abuse when my escape was. But even though I always knew what was going to happen when we went to the family friends, I still had the option on Sunday morning. Do I want to stay home, or do I want to go visit my grandparents? And every single time, knowing full well what my options were, I always still went with my dad. And I think that just goes to show just how afraid I was to be in that house. So when I said earlier about, at 5 years old, I wanted to grow up to be somebody that could save the 5-year-old little Tad. I didn't know what that person would be. I'd never heard of a superhero until I was 17, essentially, because I didn't have TV. I didn't have, books, comic books. I didn't talk to anyone at school. So I wouldn't have known anything about that. Police wasn't really anything on my mind per se, because I didn't see them. It's I was in the basement at home, or I was going like maybe to and from school. I might see the police car drive by, sort of thing, but I just wasn't privy to them. So it was just these things I just didn't know. But as time went on, I started to realize that it was a police officer I wanted to become, because you do have the authority, the power, the ability to help somebody. You can rescue them, you can save them, you can get them out. And I know I'm simplifying it in to make this easier to appreciate, is this, that I started recognizing that I wanted to be a police officer. But the thing is that with all those years of being down on myself, being told that I was worthless, useless, no one would love me, and never going to grow into amount to anything, I carried that with me. That baggage stayed with me all the way through my young adult life. It was when I was 17 years old, I ran away from home, never looked back. I didn't plan that night. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just ran. I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have friends. I never felt as though I had a trusted adult to confide in. So I walked all night long. And it was in the middle of the night that something, to me, I call it magic, happened. And that is that reality hits. I mean, it took me until 17 years old, but reality hit. The reality being that there's not a soul out there that is ever truly going to be able to help me until I am ready and willing to get the help. And And what I mean by that is that for 12 years of my life, I sat locked in the dungeon waiting for someone to come and save me because it was so obvious. I'm locked in a dungeon, like everyone can see, except the reality was nobody knew. Nobody knew I was locked in a dungeon because I hadn't told anybody. And I'm told as an adult now, my aunt and uncle had come over to the house several times when I was growing up, and they asked, like, where's Tad? And the answer was always, he's in the basement. But no one ever went further with that because, well, why would you? The answer is there. And of course, you're not thinking abuse, neglect, dungeons. You're not thinking that. You're thinking, yeah, that teenager doesn't want to be around the adults. Works fine for us. So that moment teaching me I needed to do something led to Friday morning. The next day, after walking the streets all night, I went into a government office, went up to the counter. I said, hi, I would like to speak to somebody, please. A social worker brought me into her office, basically said, like, what are you here for? And as we all know with victims, you don't just flip a switch and start talking about everything, things that you have never shared or even really accepted in your own mind. We say little bits because we test. We want to make sure we're safe and comfortable and it's not going to come back to haunt us, whatever we just released. That's exactly what I did. But whatever it was I did say that morning, my social worker came up with a plan that I was going to be removed from the home immediately. I've never seen them again, my father or that woman. I began to build my life. But I had a lot of work to do because the mental wellness, the piece that, many years ago we did not speak about. You didn't talk about mental health. You didn't talk about mental wellness. You were insane. You were the R word. You were all these terrible, nasty things that certainly was not indicative of wanting to create a safe environment to have conversations. It was, you were either normal or you were off the deep end and you need to be in some sort of hospital. So it's, I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't reach out. And for me, it took until 21 years old when I attempted suicide. I look back now on the moment of attempting suicide and I realized it was the smallest, like just the smallest incident ever. And it almost cost me my life. And yet I remember everything about that moment. I remember there would have been no talking me out of it. There would have been no change in my mind. I closed my door. I locked it. I didn't write notes. I didn't make phone calls. I truly, in that moment, wanted to end everything. But the next morning when I woke up, my goodness, was I ever angry. In fact, I was so angry that it was just one of those things that I made that promise to myself that I'm never going to allow myself to get to that state anymore. I'm going to talk about this. This isn't right. I started reaching out to therapists. I mean, if anyone has ever been to a therapist before, you'll know that not all therapists are gonna gel with you. It's because it's still another human being. You need to have that sense of connection. And for me, it took 8, but I was worth it. I was worth seeking out the one that was going to work. I still to this day speak to Shauna every Thursday. In fact, it's fantastic. And I talk all the time about investing in yourself. I had to invest in myself at a young age, multiple ways, not only to stay alive, but to go to like a family doctor to find out, like, is something naturally wrong with me? Like, for instance, like blood sugar low, or like, is there something that this can, feeling of worthlessness and mental illness, could it be corrected with medication? Or do I also need to invest in myself as far as psychologists were concerned? And it turned out it was both. I take a little white pill every morning that helps with anxiety. I'm still a very, very introverted person, even though I do a terribly extroverted job. I just put that aside. It's like there's just two of me. There's the petrified, terrified, just want to be by myself Tad, like the introvert, or there's the extrovert, throw me in a room and I can talk for hours, and I should probably win an Academy Award of some sort, because it's the total opposite of the person I genuinely am. It's just, I figured out the ability to be able to talk openly. And when you're not talking about something that you actually need to research or study or go to school for, you're talking about your lived experiences. You can read your audience. You, like, for instance, when I'm standing in front of youth or adults, I can see when they're moved, they're listening, they're understanding, they're connecting. And I think there's nothing more powerful when you're a speaker or an educator, and you can see in the youth's eyes that you're making you're making a connection, because that's all I've ever wanted. I don't want to change the world. I never have thought that way. I just want to change one person's world. But for me, my life had moved on. I finally invested in myself again at 32 years old. I believed in myself to the point that I recognized that I wanted to give myself a chance when it came to being a police officer. I applied, and as you heard, I am a police officer now. I think what it was is I had to be ready for rejection, and that was something as a child that I experienced so often. As an adult, and I know I still do it to this day, I want to protect myself from being rejected, because it hurts, and it's triggering, and it brings back memories and all those things. So why try to apply for a dream if the dream is just going to say, no, you're not good enough for this, even though that's not the words they would have used. That's how in my mind I would have interpreted it. And of course, you're going to feel low on yourself. But thankfully, I had the skills and everything required to make it work. So that's my life, except I didn't realize the journey was not over. I thought that was it. Like, I'm going to live my life happily ever after as a police officer, dream come true. Everything in the past has been dealt with as far as psychological. I'm not mad anymore, like nothing. No, I very rarely get triggered. Everything's good. Until one night, October 2011, finished my shift. I started my career with the RCMP in Surrey, BC. And I just read the news as I do every day. And I saw a headline that says, Ottawa teenager takes his own life because of severe bullying. And in that article that night, I read about a 15-year-old Ottawa teenager named Jamie Hubley. He was relentlessly tortured and abused all through school because he was openly gay and he was a figure skater. In connection with that, he struggled with mental illness. His family was very, very switched on. They did everything possible to try to get him the care and the support. The bullying was relentless. At 15 years old, Jamie took his own life. And when I read this article, I don't know what it was. I mean, as you can well imagine, in my line of work, especially big city policing, I see tragedy every day. I'm a part of it. That's what I typically see in somebody's life. I read the news every day. I've read about suicides. I've seen suicides. But there was something about Jamie's story. This young man I'd never met before. I'd never heard of before. And I just connected. Like all of a sudden he was like my little brother that wasn't here anymore. And a fire started in me that night that I realized that there are students in school today that feel the exact same way that I felt many, many years ago. And it was eye-opening to me, because it was almost like until I guess it was, I was like 38 years old, that I still, in the back of my mind, believed that I was the only person in high school that experienced what I did. I was the only one that was alone or targeted or beat up or ostracized or all those things. It was just me. And then when I read about Jamie, I was like, oh my gosh, it wasn't just me, and it certainly isn't just me. So I went to a local school like at lunch, and thought I'm going to see what groups are meeting that day. Just sit in the back of the room because I just wanted to hear high school students talk. What is it like in school nowadays? I was in uniform, so I was a little naive to think that I could just sit in the back of a classroom and no one's going to recognize or ask questions. There were 11 students, 2 adults. We started talking. They started asking questions, and I was just letting it all out, which was a very first for me ever. And the teacher at the end said, you know what, would you be willing to come and talk to another class of mine? Like, that was incredible. And it was just an open forum chat, just like we are having right now. But the kids, all 11 of them, were looking up to me, not because I'm TAT. They weren't looking up to me because I'm TAT. They were looking up to me because they are looking for adults to look up to. So I took that teacher up. I went and spoke to another class, in another school, in another province, in another country. Then fast forward 9 years later, I haven't stopped talking. I get invited to the most incredible experiences, opportunities. It doesn't matter big or small to me. If you just get the opportunity to share, to break some barriers down, to remove some stigmas, I'm never going to say no. I'm going to. But the power of of words is, I think, what, if there was a social experiment to be done about what bullying ends here, which is the charity that I've called and I run, would be the fact that that classroom of 11 students and 2 adults has now 9 years later turned into 1.25 million people that I've stood in front and delivered my presentation, all from word of mouth, because I don't advertise myself. There's no need to, and plus it would feel really weird. Just talking. So I think that's what I really enjoy about sessions like today, is that we're just talking. There's no studying, there's no PowerPoint, there's no, you know what I mean? Like, you, when you do things, and not to take away from those learning experiences whatsoever, it's just everyone learns in different ways. This is the way I learn, is just talking and listening and life experiences. If you had put up a whole bunch of slides, you would have lost me. It's that's because that's not my learning style. So we need every program that's out there. We need every way of learning out there. This just happens to be my personal favorite. And it's really easy when I do all my travel. I don't have to carry anything with me. Everything's in my mind. I just have to show up and make sure I've got my pink shirt on. That's it. And I do pretty well with that. So yeah, so feel free.
Yes, thank you so much, Tad, for speaking so openly about your experience. And really, I think, inviting us into this theme that we see time and time again of human resiliency, of what it is that, you know, the horrific things that we have to go through, the devastating things that we have to go through, especially when it comes to things like sexual violence and sexual abuse, right? But reinstilling that power that we have within us to make the change, right? But I think it also really speaks to something that's really important in terms of with Champions for Children this week, right? And how, by way of us learning about your experience and you inviting us into the reality of child abuse, right? And how, in all its different nuances and its complexities, of how oftentimes people don't understand the reality of what's taking place, right? And I think that's a lot of really what's been driving our campaign this year is how do we, you know, open those conversations, and how do we learn and empower each other so that you don't have to live through 18 years of something like that without ever being able to have somebody that you trust to be able to speak to, right? To have to live in silence for that long, right?
Yeah.
So, and, you know, with all of, and now that it's taken you on, you know, this healing journey and this adventure that you've been on to live the life that you're living today and connecting with children and youth, is really where we kind of want to shift into the conversation today, and talking about, you know, child abuse specifically online, because I think that's such a big piece right now. I think just when we talk about what's not only what's happened in the world in the last 10 years of the way in which things have shifted technologically, right? But I think especially during COVID, where that's really the one outlet,
Yes.
that we've really had to have, being that all of kind of our external connections have been, you know, taken away, I guess you could say, right? So, you know, share with us a little bit about, you know, when you're sharing your story and you're giving these presentations in schools. You had mentioned that when we were talking earlier that oftentimes after your presentation you get home, your phone's blown up with messages from youth that are reaching out and talking to you, right? So, you know, based on having those experiences and having those dialogues online, what have you experienced? What are you noticing? What are the common conversations that are happening? What are the common conversations that youth are sharing with you?
Great question, because there are some, I mean, I'll share some data with you, and data being what's come to me. So I'm not a study person, like I don't read studies or anything like that. It's, again, not my learning style, especially when I have such a wide array of people that I'm speaking to, whether it's educators, teachers, facilitators, police officers, corrections, students themselves en masse. I mean, I get probably on average about 100, 125 messages a day. I'm absolutely thrilled with that, because that goes to show the connection has been made. They know I'm a safe person. They can reach out, they can talk, they can share. I think the concern I have, however, is my target audience is always junior high, senior high, as far as the priority of who I speak with. And to put that in age perspective, basically 11 years and onwards. In the last 9 years, I would say it's pretty close to 75,000 to 80,000 messages. Typically always around 10 o'clock at night. I know what's happening to kids at 10 o'clock. They've taken their technology to bed, they're winding down, they're reflecting on the day. I'm thrilled that I come across their minds. I think the part that this really leads to, and it's going to be directly connected to what you're speaking about with, child exploitation and so forth on the internet, is the fact that of those 75 to 80,000 messages, I have had one single parent ever start chatting to me saying, "Hey, like, who are you? Why are you talking to my kid? I mean, I'm an openly gay police officer, 47-ish, I think, somewhere on there, years old. And only one parent has ever messaged to say, like, who are you?" I mean, none of my conversations are inappropriate, obviously. I never take it to a phone call. Everything is always on the internet, so that way it can always be tracked. Unfortunately, it's the reality we live in now. But I think that's kind of frightening, because to me, what that shows you is that parents are not monitoring their children's use of the cell phone or the computer. And I find that so frightening because, well, I know how kids think because I was one, and I happen to have a whole lot of memories about being a child. And the one thing is that, when I was a child, it was a gold mine if you could ever find a naughty magazine, a XXX porn magazine somewhere that someone was throwing out or something. That was the gold mine. But now it's right there with a few clicks on your phone, on the computer. You can get it 24/7 for free. There's no monitoring. There's no context that these kids are having access to. We are giving them iPads at 2, 3, 4 years old saying, go play. And I'm not insinuating they're on porn. But when they do get to that age, of course they're going to be on porn sites. They're going to be on sites that are exposing them to things that have no context behind. And I know that's causing us an issue because I saw several years ago that these youth had been exposed to pornography for quite some time, and they were slowly getting older. And now in the last few years, it's starting to really rear its ugly head. We have youth that are now, they're experiencing puberty, they're experiencing sexuality, they're exploring their bodies. They've been watching porn forever. And they truly believe that the way that you show love is physical contact or kissing without consent. Now, are they wrong? Well, lawfully, of course they're wrong. But in their minds, they're not wrong because that's what they've been exposed to. That's what they've seen. That's what they believe that love is. And so I think that's why we have this little bit of an uphill battle right now, is having these conversations of what is consent, what is appropriate boundaries, what is what do we need to look for to understand what the law states and what's out there. And it's a whole multitude of conversations that need to be had, and not one-offs. Like, they need to be had all the time from various people, whether it's the people in the child's life at home, whether it's the teachers in a school, whether it's the family members that the youth have. We need to have the conversations over and over so young people know that it's inappropriate and illegal, depending on your age, to go and start grabbing someone's behind or their breasts or grab them and just start kissing. It's wrong. And I think that's what we have to go back to is just an adaptation to, now we have social media, what parents used to be able to monitor because, they knew what their kids were doing because they spoke to the other families that the kids were visiting their homes or what have you. Now we don't. I don't know whatever happened to it, but it's just, there's such a lack of, and I say this word so loosely, but there's such a lack of policing of children. And I don't mean that as in we have to monitor what they're doing looking for negative. I don't mean that at all. I mean the absolute opposite. Watch what they're doing to learn, to educate yourself on where the conversations need to go. What do we need to discuss? You know, if we're looking at our child's search history on the phone, we're going to see the sites they're going to. If we were to go to the apps they're using on the phone, we're going to see the way they're communicating with other people and the way other people are communicating with them. If we open up our child's phone and see, we're going to see that at 10 o'clock at night, they're messaging a grown man, having conversations that, again, totally appropriate, but there's so much room for something to go sideways. They trust me, they know me, they've met me in person. But trust can be really easy when it comes to the internet, especially with our young people. And I've fallen prey to it myself as a grown adult. You believe you're talking to a person and you're not, or at least the person that you think you're talking to. So yeah, so there's a whole lot to unpackage there. I know we have a lot of work to do. I know it's very difficult to try to explain to parents that, you know what, it's not about looking at your child's phone, looking for wrong things. You're looking to build trust, to have an understanding, because they're going to do it. I mean, say don't look at porn, they're going to go to porn. Just like when we were younger, don't smoke. Well, of course we did go and smoke. Don't drink. Well, of course we went to drink. So we have to accept they're going to do it. Let's just give the context at least. And of course, that leads to sexting. And I am most certain that you're well aware of just how it's mind-numbing, the amount of sexting that's going on amongst kids, especially because I'm an SRO, a school resource officer of a high school, just started in January, and I have seen more photos of young people's bits because they're sharing it. And then they come to me and they say, like, is this inappropriate? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, please never let me see that again. But of course it's inappropriate. But these are the things, right? We're dealing with a younger age, and we can't always look at everything through our own eyes, our own educated adult eyes. We have to look at through the kids. And so if we know they're going to sext, we, in my opinion, and many other experts out there that I follow, we need to teach our kids how to do it safely. And that may sound silly, but as far as don't include your face, don't include your address, don't include a tattoo that says your name on it. You know, we're not going to stop them from doing it unless we remove their social media technologies altogether. I can't imagine that's ever going to happen now, especially that we've introduced online learning just about everywhere in this country, and I know in our neighbors down south as well, that the social media is here to stay. So we, as adults, we need to understand that, and we need to start working with that, and we need to start looking at our kids' phones. And we're probably going to see things we don't want to see, but I'd rather you see it now at a young age when you can deal with it than it's because I'm standing at the door with your child in uniform because something has happened. An allegation's been made, something that in the scope of the law has been broken. And in today's environment, there's very little room for anything, because it can go on the internet now as well. So it's not just the kids involved. Now we're talking about how far did it spread? You know, what names have been attached to this? Is it on the dirty.com? Like all these sites that are out there. So yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. So
I told you my answers actually can be quite long. So it's
you're providing a lot of value in them, right? And that's important. So I think it's, and you know, and so I think the key piece here is, like, before we get to this place, right? It's this early intervention, and I think that there's kind of two pieces to this question, right? Where I think that, you know, of course it begins in the home in terms of, you know, how do we start to create safe spaces? How do we encourage parents to, you know, have the courage to have these conversations, right? So I guess the first question that comes to mind is in terms of just like approaches, right? Is how, you know, and this can be parents, this can be legal guardians, but I think in the context of when we're talking about like community caregivers as well this week, right? Whether it's a teacher, a coach, and I know that kind of gets to be a bit of a gray area, and I can be, you know, in terms of how do you set a boundary as a community caregiver, respecting your role, right? Not invading privacy and, you know, again, crossing boundaries of getting into personal life and stuff, right? So I know that's kind of, there's a lot of nuances there, right? But, you know, first of all, what are the approaches for, excuse me, how do we create those boundaries? Is there a way to even have a conversation around boundaries itself? When we're talking about youth, in terms of how do we establish a relationship so that youth understand that parents do have to play some role, right? So how does that role get established? How do you communicate? How can we have a healthy dialogue about what's happening on technology without it feeling invasive, without, and I know that it's very challenging when it comes to teenagers and, privacy and, when you go through that phase of not wanting your parents to know anything and you think that you know everything, right? So, the first question there is the approaches of how do you even begin to establish that kind of, that boundary, that relationship with technology. And then the second piece really comes to that, it's a bit of a disclosure. I guess it's in a way, it's like an indirect disclosure, right? So what would happen as well, so I think that's the two things. How do you prepare the guardian to the guardian, the parents, the caregiver, to be able to establish that relationship in itself, right? So that those conversations can be had before something serious happens. But then also the second piece is the response aspect of it. How do we as a parent or a guardian or communicator receive something? So like you said, if we're going on the phone and we're finding that they're searching a porn website, or we're finding that there's nudes, or we're finding that something is happening in their peer groups, right? Yep. How do we then begin to handle that? So I guess it's the boundary piece, the approach, and then also the disclosure.
Right. And I can only share my experiences of what I've learned and what I believe to be the case. And of course, some of those experiences come from my line of work as well. I think that one of the ways that we need to get more people involved, which is going to be the parents and the guardians, is the fact that in this country, in Canada, you cannot lawfully sign a contract under the age of 18. So what that means is that you have a cell phone that has access to everything, but yet if something goes wrong with that cell phone, we don't actually have anyone to hold accountable for it, because the way the laws in this country are written is that if I can track it back to the phone, that doesn't necessarily mean I've tracked it back to the person that used the phone to send out or exchange or what have you that's been. Of course, as a human being, I know who did it. No one cares what human being Tad knows. They care about what can be proven in a court of law. And that is very, very difficult to do. So if right now in this country, I'll say the province of Alberta, because driving is a little different, but if someone takes my car right now and they go get a bunch of tickets and everything, I'm responsible for it. Even though I wasn't in that car, I'm still responsible for everything that happens with my vehicle. So why aren't we having that same thing, that an adult is responsible for everything that's happening with the contract that they've signed? And I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not saying we start jailing parents or ticketing parents. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about just accountability, as far as we can't just say, oh, like, I didn't know my child was doing that. Well, okay, fair enough. I believe you, because you probably had no idea your child was doing that. But that's, ignorance is not a defense. You're responsible for what comes out of that phone. So you should be well aware of what's being said. And again, if your child, some children are very more advanced than others, and this kind of monitoring and checking and safety features of looking at their phone doesn't have to be done like until they're 20. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying, like, basically once they get to that point that that they're a genuine good young person, and that if they make a mistake in life, it's going to be a natural mistake that a young person makes. A natural mistake that a young person makes is not taking somebody's nude photo and sending it all over social media. That's not a normal mistake. That's something that should have been caught so long prior to that. Whether it's the person that took the photo, that parent or guardian should have found it on the phone, or it's all the other kids that now have the photo on their phone. Just one of their parents is all it would take, or guardian, to look and be like, how come Mike is sending out this photo to everybody? It's just understanding, like, who our kids are hanging out with, what groups they're a part of. Our kids are smart. They know to use Snapchat, because most of their conversations and pictures and videos disappear quite quick. But they're not that smart. They just think they're smart. Because if it ever got to the point of doing a criminal investigation, I just have to seize the phone, take it to our diagnostic center, plug it in, and everything's going to come back to life. So just like our email accounts, when we push delete, it's not gone. All we're doing is saying, please take this away from me. I don't need to see this anymore. So delete. It is still in the social media atmosphere or the internet sphere somewhere. It's just a matter of having someone that knows how to hunt it down or to find it again. So I think that's what we really need to do with kids is have them aware of what the serious repercussions could be of what they're sharing. I mean, I have so many followers on Instagram. I feel like I'm Big Brother, not Big Brother as in government Big Brother, Big Brother as in Tad. And I am mystified of what I see on Instagram that kids are posting. Like, it's an open forum. Family members typically should be friends with their kids, I would think. It's not private. And they're using F-bombs. They're using the FAG word. They are referencing sexual assault as though it's some sort of game. They're sharing pictures. They are just such inappropriate language. And I know, because whenever I speak to adults, like a parental presentation, I'll explain to them saying, you know what, you as a parent maybe on the liberal side think, you know what, what's the big deal? My kid dropped an F-bomb at 13 years old on social media. It's like, you know what, I get it. However, I want you to think about something. I'm an employer. So when your child goes to apply for a job and all they have is babysitting and dishwashing experience on their resume, just like every other student does to start, and I'm going through all these pieces of paper, the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to everyone's social media account. Long before I'm giving them a call or setting up an interview, I'm checking to see what have they been posting. And I'll tell you right now, if I find a young person has posted, you know, photos that are exceptionally inappropriate language, clear disregard for the health laws that we have in place, as temporary as they are. But if the kids are out, you know, sharing photos today, they're all arm in arm, you know what, I'm not hiring that person. I'm turning that piece of paper over and I'm going to the next one. And they are never going to know why that is the case. So I think when you put it into layman's terms for parents of saying, you know what, you may not think very much of your child putting an F-bomb, but I sure do as a potential employer. And I'd venture to say I'm not the only one out there that wants to hire the very best of the best when it comes to youth representation. Of course we want great kids to come and work for us. So there's that. And I've been going on so long. I'm sorry, Ashley, I forgot the other 2 points too.
It's okay, it was a long-winded question. We've got about 15 minutes left, and then I'm going to open the floor for conversations. But I think what's really interesting is, you know, there's elements of that come back through your own lived experience, right? Of how you spoke to that, you know, unfortunately you did not have a parent, a guardian, a community caregiver during that time when you were experiencing abuse, right, to be able to disclose, to be able to reach out, right? And it was really coming to that place that you did in your life to find that within you, right? And we talk about this, and we talked about it even before we got on the call today of the ways, even with your charity, you're allowing you to have that responsibility piece, right? So I think the other side of the conversation, and I'm curious to hear your opinion in terms of when we talk about things from an institutional level, right? Of what's the responsibility from an institutional level, and that, you know, and that kind of gets into a conversation in terms of, you know, how do we hold large corporations accountable, you know, when it comes to safe practices, right? If we're talking about Facebook, if we're talking about Instagram, right? Where there's also that side of the conversation where, yes, parents need to understand that they have a responsibility, you know, to protect their child from something happening, right? By being able to have those conversations early, by being able to establish those boundaries with technology, right? But then on the other side of it, I guess, in terms of empowering youth in themselves, right? So what are your thoughts in terms of an institutional level of, you know, because they do, I mean, Facebook and Instagram have so much influence on so many of our lives, right? But I think particularly when we're talking about youth, right? What's their role in communicating safe practices?
Well, I think the challenge you face when it comes to social media and cyberbullying and everything that comes along with that is the fact that the vast majority of these companies are not in Canada. which means they don't have to follow Canadian law. So it's always really quick when you read the news and you see something that happened on the internet, and someone comes forward and says, you know, the police should have done this, or look at, it's that person. It's like, okay, I understand that, but again, nobody cares what human being Tad thinks. They only care about evidence when it comes to the court of law. If these companies aren't based in Canada, they have zero obligation to follow Canadian laws. So for instance, if I needed to get access to a Facebook account because it's targeting the LGBTQ community, as I only bring this up because it was one of the first ones I had when I was at the high school, Facebook has zero obligation to provide me information. They do, and they're pretty good at it, so I'll give them credit there. But the fact is, they don't have to. There was an app that was extremely popular probably about 5 years ago called Ask FM. I was getting bombarded with kids reaching out saying about Ask FM, and all it was just a chat line, but it was all anonymous. And as you can imagine, there were some people in society that preyed on our young people, to the point that in England alone, I believe, Ask FM was directly linked to at least 8 youth suicides. But the app was based out of Latvia. So what can I do with it? Like, it's, as a police officer, my hands are tied. I can't make the authorities in another country follow what our rules and laws of our land are. There's nothing I can do. I can reach out to them and ask and request, but as you can imagine, just that alone, the time sensitivity of what's going on, we're talking weeks, if not months, even years before you get responses from these far off places where these apps are based out of. So the challenge we face is, it's easy to say, well, here's what we should do. I'm personally, and I know I wouldn't be the most popular person with this thought, but I'm personally to the thought that we shouldn't be allowed to be anonymous on the internet. It's so for instance, if you're on Twitter, you can only have one account per person. I think that's the way it's supposed to be, but again, no enforcement is taking place. But you shouldn't be allowed to just go and anonymously attack other people without any facts, without any basis, without anything. So how do you, again, using the terrible word of it, but how do you police that? It's such a slippery slope, because it's going to be morals, it's going to be religions, it's going to be opinions, it's going to be facts that all come into play on where do we draw the line of what's right and wrong, and how do you go about finding the information if somebody does something wrong? How do you find the information in order to hold somebody accountable? It's extremely difficult, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if there is an answer. It's unless we ever became a country like, I think it's China, that has like it's the communists, like you can't have access to a lot of sites on the internet and that sort of thing. Unless we ever headed that route, which again, super slippery slope, who decides yes and no? I don't think that would ever fly in our country, and I don't think to our friends in the South either, that anything like that would ever fly. So how do you have freedom of speech and yet monitor the fact that your speech could actually be hurting somebody else or harming someone else? I don't know. Now, as far as institutions, as far as schools, and having youth that want to come forward and talk, a lot of schools have counselors in the school, and they can come forward and there. But when you start getting to disclosures, you're again on a real difficult path, because there's certain obligations that when a youth crosses a certain threshold of information, that another layer of authority needs to come in. Sometimes the principal might need to come in and be privy to it. Sometimes the parents need to be called right away. Sometimes the police need to be involved. So it's really difficult for someone that's a young person that is experiencing or has experienced something that can be quite traumatic to them, that they're ready to speak, and they have chosen how they want to speak. So they have chosen who their safe person is, but the safe person is immediately putting up a stop sign saying, whoa, okay, you've said enough right now. Hang tight here. I got to get someone you've never met before to come in, or I've got to get your family to come. And sometimes the family is what the problem is. It's, and I wouldn't even say sometimes, a lot of the times, it's the family, it's the household where some of these traumas are coming from. So to call the family and get them involved, or child family services, or what have you, it's so difficult to protect a child and let them speak freely. And of course, you have the liability on the adult that this information is being shared to. Where can they say, okay, like, I'm out, I've shared, I listened, I did my part, and not now be held accountable for the information that was shared. I think it's really difficult. And that's something that I have to put on my website. If someone starts sharing, I let them know, like, you're just talking to me. It won't go to anyone, but I'm not crisis. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. And I do have obligations. So if you tell me anything about you want to take your own life or anything suicidal that's imminent, I will be sharing it. And I say that right up front. So it's because I'm not the person that you need to be sharing that with. I can't help. It's crisis intervention is not what I'm going to be able to help with. I'm able to help with what we're doing today, talking openly and sharing non-judgmentally. But I'm not going to be able to help when it comes down to trying to find long-term, care or therapy sort of things. So yeah, it's just not as easy as I think sometimes our good friends in the media want to say, like, just say, well, the police should have done something, the school should have done something. It's like, well, it's not that easy. If it was that easy, we wouldn't have these issues in society, quite frankly. We wouldn't be where we are.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. It's just, yeah, there's so many layers, so many complexities to things, right? And I think it's finding the answers and, figuring out how to even create, intervention, and all. There's just so many moving parts always, right? So
yeah.
Before we get into question period, I think the last thing that I wanted to ask you too, in terms of, with your unique position in policing, with the intersectionalities, and I think just the unique experiences that you have with your connection to youth by way of having presentations and having them connect with you, really very much being that community caregiver, in the sense that you are a safe place for a lot of youth to disclose, to share, right? How has that impacted your own practice as a police officer, and what gaps and things have you witnessed within policing as well that need to be recognized based on your experiences?
Well, from what I've come across is, when you have any speaking policing related now, when you have any police officer dealing with youth, you need a special kind of police officer. It's and that's the same with anyone in society. If you're going to have anyone dealing with youth, you need a special type of person to be dealing with youth, because they aren't in the same mind space. They don't have the same experience. They don't have the same understanding. They're not thinking with the same part of the brain. You need somebody that can communicate. And police are, we're super easy targets for everything. We always have been, long before I've ever gotten into this line of work. But the challenge is that, for me, the biggest challenge is that now youth have a safe person to come to. They're sharing their thoughts on policing. And I know you've all seen it, you've heard it. Some of it is warranted, much of it is not. That the kids are saying, like, I don't want police in my school because I'm afraid of them. And I think those voices need to be heard. But I think we need to be having some deeper conversations with that person who's afraid of a police officer in their school. We need to ask, like, why are you afraid? Where is it a perceived fear, or is it an actual fear? Like, have you personally had a negative experience with police, or are you afraid of police because you've basically been taught to be afraid of the police? Maybe your family, have some experience. I know in my family, I've got a criminal in mine, and he makes it very clear you shouldn't like the police. And, if that's somebody that as a child you're looking up to, those opinions and thoughts are they're being ingrained in you. Reading the news would not take you very long to start having a very negative thought about police, because no matter where in the world we are all still called the police. But the Calgary Police Service, for instance, is very, very different from a police service in Ontario or a service down in the United States. We're all very different because we're all at different places. We're all independently funded on where we are. So for instance, Calgary, we've had body cams for years, whereas there's other services in Canada that they're still doing trials to find out, should we do body cameras? There are police services in this country that are now starting to recognize, you know, we should have mental health nurses driving around with police. Calgary Police Service, we've had that for 8 years now. But it's these types of things that aren't being communicated out as effectively as I think it could be, to let people know that we need your input. But if you're afraid of us, I personally, that troubles me. Because I grew up in the total opposite frame of mind. I grew up totally loving the police, idolizing the police, wanting to be the police. Now I am the police, and I'm all for doing everything I can to make the police be the very best they can be. But at the end of the day, I'm only in charge and in control of one person, and that's me. I can't change the laws. I can't change thoughts or personalities. I can't do any of that. All I can do is live by example. And that's what I try doing. And some of the conversations I'm having with youth are really difficult conversations, because they're sharing things that they truly believe to be fact, when in fact, there's a lot more facts to go along with the fact that they have. So it's, it's just, for me personally, I think that's the biggest challenge is growing up to idolize an occupation. But when you're in the occupation, even though the vast majority of people are very, very grateful for police, the vast majority of the population are silent though, so we don't know about them. I do, because I drive a police car all day long, so I see the waves and you know, all the kindness there. But the fact is that there are other people out there in society that absolutely hate me because of the uniform I wear or the job that I do. And for me, I know that has a little bit to do with my upbringing as well, it's like, I don't understand that. It's like, but I try to do the best job I can. I did not do what you saw in that video. I am not that person, nor are anyone that I work with, because I would have no issue calling somebody out. And I know that's the way we're going. It's police don't want bad apples in our groups either. So I think for being a police officer now, working in a school and going into so many schools around the world, is having the opportunity to be a person that youth can now see beyond what they've been told or taught. They can see that I'm just another guy. I'm just a guy named Tad. I come home to my puppy. I sit in the sun. I watch Blue Jay games. I have a model railroad. Like, I'm a perfectly normal, everyday person, but sometimes someone can only see the uniform, and I accept that. I recognize that. I'm just saying that that's what I'm personally working on, is that leading by example. If I can break down some barriers, not by telling anyone, by showing them, then that's what I'll just keep doing. I don't hear any.
I'm muted. Thank you so much, Tad. This has been such an enjoyable and insightful and inspiring conversation, really. I would like to know, we've got about 15 minutes left before we are going to end today's conversation, so I really wanted to open it up to the floor for anybody that has questions. Anything that sparked inside you from our conversation with Tad today. So Christina is along here with me. She's our moderator, so I will check in with her and see what we're doing, where we're at for the questions.
Yeah, for sure. Hello. So I'll allow folks the opportunity to continue typing in the chat if you have any questions. So you can either direct message me in the drop-down tool that's in the chat, or if you would like to ask your question directly to Tad and you aren't camera shy, you can just use the reaction bottom in the bottom middle of your screen and just do the applause. And we will be able to get to you and unmute you to ask a question. So in the meantime, as those filter through, I have a question for you, Tad. So in this idea of community caregivers and just sort of all of us interact with children regardless, whether that's in our personal lives, professional lives, and that type of thing. So is there a person or a particular incident or something that made a positive difference for you when you were a child and experiencing abuse? And I know you kind of gave a brief encapsulation of your story. And was there even just a small moment or a small person who did have a positive impact?
Yes, his name was Mr. Ross. He was my law teacher in high school. Interesting story. He was my law teacher, but because the rules were so strict for me, I couldn't stay after school and talk to him or anything. But whenever I was able to say hi, it was just, I don't know, he just had this magical touch about his aura that I just felt like he was my safe person. I never disclosed anything like that, like to him then, but for me, he was that light of brightness for me. And I remember at the end of high school, he knew that Tom Cochrane, the Canadian singer, was one of my favorites. And Mr. Ross is one of identical triplets. So those of you that watch CBC Sports, there's a Mr. Ross that does CBC Sports. Well, he looks exactly like my Mr. Ross does. But the third triplet was Tom Cochrane's tour manager. So right when I left school, Mr. Ross gave me tickets to go, because I had now run away from home. I was on my own. He gave me tickets to go to Tom Cochrane's concert in Kitchener, Ontario, with the opportunity to go backstage afterwards and meet him. And I mean, it's just beyond words at this time. I go, Life is a Highway is the big song. He ends up singing that song 3 times that night. He goes overboard on time. I can't go meet him afterwards. Fast forward 25 years later, Mr. Ross reaches out to me, like through email. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, you know, how incredible. Mr. Ross, you were my safe person. You would never have known that, but I wrote about you in my book even. And I said, you're never going to believe this, but you may never remember, but when I was in high school and I left, you gave me 2 tickets to go see Tom Cochrane. And I said, you even went so far as to get me backstage passes, but I wasn't able to go because Tom had gone long. And I said, and you have just sent me this email now, and it's total fluke that 2 days before I just bought 2 tickets to go see Tom Cochrane. I'd never seen him in all those years in between. So it's like his ears must have been buzzing. He, you know, he's like, oh, you know, lovely to hear from you. I left teaching basically when I left, and then so we went a few days with no communication. Then he sent me another email, and the title was 25 Years Too Late. And he said, Tad, you're never going to believe it, but my brother is still the tour manager for Tom Cochrane, and I've got you backstage passes to go and meet Tom. So I was like, oh my gosh, like, just talk about feeling like that little boy again. I mean, I even got the little hairs on my arm sticking up, just reflecting on this. And so when I went back to meet Tom, I met Mr. Ross, and I shared with him the story. And Tom is just like, wow, like, what a small world. And I was like, I know, it's just incredible how everything just all comes together. So even 25 years later, Mr. Ross still remembered me. Even though I know I didn't do anything to stand out in school, because I was the under the rock at all times type of fella. It's just, yeah, like it had to have been meant to be, because why else would he, after 25 years, send me a message 2 days after I bought tickets to go and see? So yeah, so that's kind of my safe person. Then there was nobody else again until I don't even know when. I guess probably the next closest one would be a television personality, Rick Mercer. I really enjoyed watching his show on Tuesday nights for half hour, always funny, always Canadian based. You know, it just struck a chord, and I watched them for years. And I mean, now he and I are very close friends, but which is still super weird because I still look at him as Rick Mercer on TV. But it's just again, just that small world that things happen, and it's the stars are lined up. And you know what? It's easy to look back on my life and be like, oh, that's too bad, poor Tad, poor Tad. I don't want that, because it's almost like the stars are like lining up to reward me for the past. I have opportunities now that I would never have had if it weren't for what I went through. And that's not to say I condone what happened to me. It's to say that it happened to me. I've owned it. I can't change it, so I have to accept it in whatever way I can. And I truly have turned it into a positive. Even in my mind, it's a positive. So if I get to share that and share some of these stories, then like I said, it's a good thing. I'm sorry to interrupt. I see Amy Harrelson, if I said that right, in Estevan. I just wanted to say hi. I don't know if we ever met when I was in Estevan. I've been there many times, and with the Estevan Police. So I just saw that on the sidebar. So if we have met before, hello again. If we haven't, hi. I know where Estevan is. I got pulled over there, actually. So yeah, no tickets though. They were just letting me know there's moose in the area, in the middle of nowhere. Where did these moose come from, by the way? But anyways, again, you can see I can go on forever.
No, I think a couple of things are interesting there. The fact that teachers sometimes can have a profound impact, or any adult sometimes in our life, and we don't even know that we're maybe actively trying to do that. And it just sort of, I think, this idea of even community care, community compassion, and empathy, if we can display and act kindly and empathetically to all of the human beings we interact with, be they children or not, you know, sometimes just one small act is enough to make a huge difference in someone else's life, right? And I also think it's interesting too, a teacher will always be Mr. or Miss. Mr. Ross, it doesn't matter, you don't have a first name, like you're not allowed. It's really weird. Yeah, so I agree. There's a question, and we can kind of maybe pair them together because they are similar-ish. So someone asking a question about they work in early childhood education and they support young parents, and we're wondering how they can best sort of relay support to parents and caregivers of young children and youth to be a part of this, be a part of their children's online activity, and basically be a part of potentially sort of interrupting bullying early. And even that idea of being aware of online activity to even interrupt grooming or kind of trafficking pieces in youth.
Yeah, the trafficking piece is really starting to come to light. It's interesting how the media has so much power on what they want to bring to light in society, because we've had human trafficking since the start of time. And working in big city Calgary, it's we've got quite a hub for human trafficking. It's really difficult when you know you're dealing with a victim that's an adult or of an adult age, and trying to work with them to let them know you can help, you can do these things. They don't know any other way. They don't know that there is safety. They don't know that it's there. And so trying to convince them while doing it when they're petrified, because there's obviously a reason why I'm in their life in that moment. Chances are something happened. It's often in a hotel room or now Airbnbs, that something's happened, and chances are the offender is there as well. So I have to be very careful on the words I use, because I don't want to put that person in further danger. But at the same time, I want to open them up to the understanding that, like, we have dedicated resources just for saving these victims. So to kind of put that into to the online component and bullying, and this is something I find so intriguing, because bullying has a very set definition. And it's really, really, really important to understand that there is a set definition. And the reason why it's so important is not to say that other behaviors or actions are acceptable. It's to say that bullying is a behavior, which means we're not going to stop it overnight. You can't just sit a child down and say, okay, like this needs to stop now. That is not what's going to happen with bullying, because bullying is you must always have the three elements. You have repetition, and repetition is not meaning one day. Repetition is meaning months, years. We've got a power imbalance. So the victim feels as though their abuser has power over them, whether it's actual or perceived, doesn't matter. It's how the victim feels. And then you have the intent. The intent of the offender is to shame, harm, and embarrass. So if we take a look at the very first element that needs to be met in order to fit the definition of bullying, we have repetition, which is months and years. Going back to the conversation we had, half an hour ago about monitoring our online activity for our young people, we should, in a perfect world, never have cyberbullying if parents are monitoring the phones of their children. Granted, we're always going to have cyberbullying for adults. That's an entirely different beast. I'm talking about kids. If a parent were to monitor their child's cell phone activity until such time they feel it's appropriate not to need to, and trust is earned, you're never going to have cyberbullying, because you're going to catch it when it was rude or inappropriate or mean behavior. That can be fixed immediately. That is when you can sit someone down and explain, I don't ever want to see this again. This is inappropriate. It's wrong. You're grounded, whatever. But if things get to the stage that it meets the actual definition of bullying, we've got a lot of work to do. It's not going to be rectified, and not just thinking about it from the offender's point of view, but thinking about it from the victim's point of view, but also from the offender's point of view. I shared with you how many emails I get. I have had a lot of emails from self-proclaimed bullies, and they tell me flat out, every single one is very, very similar. And I touched on this earlier, how bullying started for me with the child laughing in the background, is that the bully feels empowered by their friends who are standing around and high-fiving or laughing or giggling or making a positive comment to the offender when they just did their behavior that they do typically, probably on a daily basis at that same time. That young person feels empowered by their peers. Meanwhile, that empowerment, though, came at the expense of somebody else. And that's where I have to work with those youth, that if they already know they're a bully, we're good. We're on the right page. Now, I also recognize I can't just respond back and say, well, stop doing it. That's not how this works. We have to work with them. And that's what I do. I come up with a plan. So what time of day do you bully this person? And they'll be like, oh, it's always at the start of school, right when I walk into school. I meet my friends at the front door, and that's where Bob sits. And I kick him every morning, and my friends give me a high five. It's like, okay. You know what, how about tomorrow, just inadvertently message your friends in advance, say, you know what, something's come up, meet me at the side door. Bob's sitting at the front door, avoid Bob. Take your friends somewhere else. No one's going to notice the difference. They're going to think something's come up. And if you just bought yourself one day of not harming Bob, that's one day that Bob didn't have. So this is the type of approach we have to do with young people who don't think with the same adult mind as we have. So that's kind of the outside the box thinking that I've had to learn as well, because for me, it's like, well, then stop. And you realize that's not how this works.
Awesome. And part of that question too was asking for you to suggest some resources, and this will be an opportunity to plug Tad's website, bullyingendshere.ca. He has a wonderful podcast that even goes into more in detail about indicators of bullying on your on children and impacts and all of these things, and kind of puts in a whole bunch of resources from across the country as well, and links to Kids Help Phone, and kind of does a really great job of essentially a literature review. And here are the resources. You did all the hard work, and they're all available there. And also an opportunity to, if you want to donate to Bullying Ends Here as well. Tad does this work himself, and it's all through grants and kind donations and things like that, and not taking a salary for sharing his story and helping youth. And so definitely is a community hero and a champion for children and youth in Canada and across the world as an international speaker. So I appreciate everyone being here and the few questions that we had, and I will pass it over to Ashley.
Have any last minute thoughts that you want to add in there, Ted?
I am just putting on here an app that came out. I haven't really looked at it too much, but I know it's getting some very positive reviews. It's Canadian, and it's Kinzu, and it's all about the younger kids using social media. So that might be somewhere to go. That might be a resource for super young. When it comes to the junior high and onwards, the Kids Help Phone is absolutely hands down the very best, and it's gone so much. And I know, like, even they feel like, wow, we kind of trapped ourselves with our name because it sounds like it's a help phone, because that's how it started, but it's so much more than that. Their website is chocker blocked with information, and you can message, you can like reach out to them through messaging, phone calls, emails, or just read what they have available. So yeah, they are by far the best resource I've ever come across in my travels so far. So.
Well, look at that. We did. Tad was trying to tell me earlier when we got on that I had to try and challenge him and throw him off with questions, but we just flowed the whole way through, and it's 1:30 and we ended perfectly on time. And wow, that was incredible, Tad. Thank you so much for your story, for your insight, for your knowledge, for just your the inspiring person that you are, and sharing this conversation. And thank you so much to everybody who's here, who's listening, and wherever you are, whatever you do, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being here and supporting our Champions for Children campaign during Sexual Violence Awareness Week. We're grateful to be able to share this space and have these important conversations. So thank you so much, Tad.
My pleasure.
We look forward to connecting with you in the future, and
yeah.
we really enjoyed being able to be here with everybody today. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your beautiful, wherever, hopefully sunny. It's sunny here, but enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, we'll all connect somewhere soon, I imagine.
And thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for taking your lunch hour to come and join. And feel free to reach out anytime. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.